I come from a law enforcement household. My father was a cop, NYPD, for over 30 years. I don't resort to or fall into the trap of thinking that the individuals and the system are hopelessly corrupt, or hopelessly toxic, or hopelessly racist, or anything like that. I just see it a little bit differently. The baffled rage that some of them have when they are being criticized comes from them thinking, and I think accurately, that they are here to enforce what society wants. Now, if you happen to be in a society where there's a whole lot of racism and you don't necessarily perceive it, or you would maybe prefer to believe it doesn't exist, then you might think that it's just the cops who are grabbing black kids and throwing them up against the wall and doing too many stops, too many frisks, and unfairly targeting them. When in reality, there's a society that has given them the go-ahead, given them the green lights. To me, the most interesting part of a movement, a reform movement that ended up with the unfortunate title Defund the Police, what they were really arguing for substantively was, don't call them so often. Let's reorganize and redeploy the police. Police are what we could call violence workers. They are there to bring violence, right? There are certain circumstances in which that's exactly what the situation calls for.
What troubles me is that there's this whole Blue Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot stand it. And I don't care if that makes me seem biased. I don't care. Hi, guys. Welcome back to my show, The Police Accountability Project. Today, I'm very excited to have my first official guest. It's Errol Louis. So Errol is a political anchor at Spectrum News. He's also a columnist at New York Magazine. He's also a professor here at Craig Newmark. He's my professor in the city government and politics class. Errol also hosts the show The Big Deal, which is about political analysis and election coverage. He also hosts a podcast called You Decide. And so Errol has been working in the industry for a couple decades. Correct me if I'm wrong on anything. And he's just very knowledgeable about politics, about New York City. And today he's going to chat with us about policing and his impressions of it, both as a journalist and just as a person, as a New Yorker. So Errol, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's over 4 decades. I'm going into my 5th decade now. So been doing this for a minute. And some stories, I'll send you the links. I've been writing about a lot of these issues, police accountability issues, since I was an undergraduate. So I've got stories from the mid or early 1980s talking about police killings of unarmed citizens all around the country.
Yeah, and so this is probably something that affects you personally. I don't want to assume what your experience with police has been like personally, because it's sort of like you have two roles, right? You have you as the journalist, as the professional that covers this type of thing, and you have you as a Black man walking through society. So let's start with your own personal experience.
Well, I come from a law enforcement household. My father was a cop, NYPD, for over 30 years. My sister was a detective. My uncle, I am the son, brother, uncle, nephew, and cousin of cops. And so I grew up where a lot of these issues were not just hypothetical, but very real about what cops do for a living, why they do it, how they do it, whether it's dangerous, whether they are protecting us from danger, whether it's a sustainable and fulfilling profession. And at one point, I even considered it for maybe a day or two. My father quietly slipped me an application for the NYPD. One of the few times my mother actually got mad at him, visibly angry at him. She'd figured at that point we had done enough for the city of New York in that particular capacity. It was turning into the family business. But no, I think about a lot of these issues from different angles. and the one that I don't have to really think about, honestly, is from a cop's point of view as a professional, meaning what kind of a job it is. I understand it as a job in a way that folks from law enforcement families would think about it, which is that they people want to do their shift, they want to do a good job, they want some praise, they want some money, they want some overtime if they can get it, and they want to come back the next day. So it's not necessarily, for at least not in my family, it wasn't like you were committing to uphold society or fight a war or make sure that civilization was intact. Those weren't exactly what the stakes were. There was some of that, but the reality is it was just a civil service job and an important one, and important that it be done properly.
Yeah. So, what deterred you from joining the force? You said you considered it just for a couple days. What made you say, "Nah, it's not for me"?
My mom, she said we did not send you to Harvard and go into Hock and invest so much in your education so you could go out there and run around in the streets like your father trying to chase criminals. And that made a certain amount of sense to me at that point. I mean, I had been exposed to a lot, and there were a lot of different opportunities, and I was really just starting to find my way into journalism. And I idolized my father like boys do, and so he gave me the application. I was like, oh, great, cool. I can be like Dad. She was like, nothing doing. That's not, they didn't ask very much of me, but when they did ask, I was going to be a good son. And my mother was like, you are not going to do this. And that was pretty much the end of it.
So, given that you've had so many family members choose this profession, would you say that has caused you to have a more balanced view of police? And I say that, quote unquote, balanced, because there's so much controversy surrounding the NYPD and the police in general. Um, but, like, how do you view the whole
Well,
situation?
I don't think, even though I've written and believed some things that are very, very critical
Mhm.
of the police in general, the NYPD in particular, I don't resort to or fall into the trap of thinking that the individuals and the system are hopelessly corrupt, or hopelessly toxic, or hopelessly racist, or anything like that. I just see it a little bit differently, and I think that's because, having seen it personally, I know that institutions, and this is not an exception, are run by people, and people are people. People want recognition, they want happiness, they want fulfillment, they want to do a good job in whatever their chosen profession is, and this is not any different. Things go badly wrong, and when there are bad individuals, they can cause an immense amount of damage and harm. There are systems that really go awry, and those systems have to be challenged and sometimes reformed, if not abolished. But I think of public safety and the role of policing as something that is just part of modern society. There are some things that are bad where you might think it needs to be abolished, and it doesn't necessarily have to be replaced. I think about that, like, say, organized crime, right? It's not like you would say, if there was no mafia, we'd have to replace it. No, we could do without La Cosa Nostra. We could just do without those characters. They're parasites. I feel the same way about drug dealers. But cops, it's like, no, they're designated by the rest of us to do something full time that all of us have to do at least part time, which is help maintain order, uphold standards, keep kids out of trouble, and make sure everybody does what they're going to do in a free society safely. We designate people to do that. There are societies that have done it better or worse than others, and there's a whole complicated question about whether they're upholding an unjust social order. But in the here and now, in the real world, in the day-to-day world, we lock our doors for a reason at night. That we expect somebody to call if we dial 911 and say somebody's trying to break down my door. We expect there to be some protection for us if we're walking in the street. our daughters, our moms, Um, so, it's a complicated question. It gets really complicated really quickly. But I think it's most helpful to think of it as we as a society are just people trying to govern ourselves,
Hmm.
in a
Hmm.
way that makes sense and is rational and that works.
Yeah. So the thing is that the modern police system did come from the slave patrols, right? It developed over time and it progressed. Of course, it's not that anymore. It's not a slave patrol, but you still see elements of racism in the institution where they actually police black and brown communities differently. They show up differently. They have sort of a different relationship with especially low income people. And would you say that that's just a few bad apples? It sounds like you don't necessarily believe that it's a hopelessly racist system. So that sounds like there's just a few people that are racist or that are tarnishing the police name for everyone, but it's not actually an inherently
Well, no.
systemic issue.
Here's what I would say is that the police and when you talk with them individually, the most the baffled rage that some of them have when they are being criticized comes from them thinking, and I think accurately, that they are here to enforce what society wants. Now, if you happen to be in a society where there's a whole lot of racism and you don't necessarily perceive it, or you would maybe prefer to believe it doesn't exist, then you might think that it's just the cops who are grabbing black kids and throwing them up against the wall and doing too many stops, too many frisks, and unfairly targeting them. When in reality, there's a society that has given them the go ahead, given them the green light, given them, in some cases, pretty explicit instructions to go out and do exactly that. So then the question becomes: is the problem the cop who is improperly and possibly even illegally profiling black and brown kids, or is the problem the people who sent him to do that? And I think it's case by case, system by system, era by era. You can learn those things. You can know those things. It's not a mystery. The stop and frisk era under Mayor Bloomberg. I've interviewed Mayor Bloomberg. I interviewed his police commissioner, Ray Kelly. His father and my father served together. They were friendly with each other. I interviewed the corporation counsel. I interviewed the advocates who sued them and won the case. I interviewed the judge who settled the case, Judge Scheinlin. The stop and frisk era did not have to happen. I would not put the blame, though, on the police department exclusively. Ray Kelly didn't just wake up one morning and say, I want to do 700,000 stops this year. He had a mayor who not only didn't mind him doing it, but on some level encouraged him to do it and certainly didn't turn him back. He had a corporation counsel, the head lawyer for the city, who blessed it and said, well, this is in keeping with the Constitution as far as my reading is concerned, and I'll defend this policy in court. They made those choices. And, you can get mad at the guy who all the way down at the end of the line is working in the 73rd precinct and has orders to go out that day and make a certain number of stops, and he goes out and does what he's told to do. I wish that person could be a hero and rebel against all of the people I just named. But that, to me, is not the center of where the problem is. To me, the center of the problem is at City Hall, and it's at One Police Plaza, and it's in the Corporation Counsel's office. And, look, frankly, it's in the voting booth. Because there was a lot of popular sentiment from the editorial boards at the newspapers, one of which I served on, to the civic groups, to the donors. There are a lot of people who are complicit in this, and
Hmm.
so my feeling is, look, let's not act like this is a problem that starts and ends at the precinct house. They're enacting something that has its origins elsewhere, and we need to look elsewhere if we really want to turn this around.
All right, I hear you, Errol. However, it makes me wonder, where does individual responsibility come in? Because, for instance, when it comes to unionizing, there's the idea that, all right, we're the workers. If we work together as a collective to demand these changes, they can't say no to all of us. They can't fire all of us, right? So it's like collective power. And my thing is, if there are police officers who believe that certain aspects of the way that they police or the system are unfair, they're racist, they're discriminatory, all of the things, corruption, all the things, um, why don't more of them speak out about it,
Mm.
or come together and change the culture from within? Because yes, it's coming from city council and those who are making the decisions about what policing looks like, but the police themselves have a lot of like oversight of their own. Like they have their own power to decide
You
how
know,
they're
no,
gonna
yeah, no,
run the institution. So
well, yes and
officers
no.
aren't speaking out. They're like, oh, okay, I come
Mm.
in, the system is corrupt, we're targeting Black and brown communities, we're giving people tickets for jumping the turnstiles.
Mhm.
In the stop and frisk era, we're doing that. But you know what? Too big of a fight for me. I'm not affected. Um, Sometimes they deserve it. I'm going to turn the other way. And so you rarely see people like Edwin Raymond, who's a whistleblower for the NYPD, that he came out and said there's all of this corruption, there's all of this deliberate targeting of underprivileged communities. And he stands almost by himself. There's just a handful of other whistleblowers over the years. There's
Sure.
just a few people that publicly support him. If all of the police aren't so bad, why aren't more of them willing to speak up?
Well, I don't know about who is or isn't bad, but the look, it's a paramilitary organization, right? So you don't get to go in and say, you know, I'm a patrolman. I answer to a sergeant who answers to a lieutenant who answers to a captain who answers to an inspector who answers to a chief. For the patrolman at the bottom of that pyramid to say, I feel like changing the policy. I'm going to do that on my own. Look, nobody kidnapped them and dragged them into the police academy and made them, take a civil service exam and a physical exam and a psychological exam so that they could become an officer, only to sort of walk onto the job and decide that they're going to be their own leader. They're going to do whatever they want, regardless of where these orders are coming from. They're going to ignore the patrol guide. They're going to ignore their sergeant. They're going to ignore their partner. That's not really just not how it works. The other thing about it, and this is something actually that journalists have in common with the police, and this is one of these things that's just a structural and organizational challenge, which is that the people who have the most discretion are actually the lowest ranking people. In many other areas, in, I don't know, banking, for example, you have to be pretty high up before you can start making major decisions. In this case, it's almost the opposite. The people who have the most experience, the most power, the most authority, and the titles are sitting back at headquarters. And it's the person who's the least experienced on the street in the moment who has probably the most discretion to sort of try and enact a policy that he or she may or may not fully understand or agree with. And that in itself creates a huge amount of problems. And journalists, I think, should be familiar with this. It's like, you send somebody out there into the middle of like a war zone, whether it's an actual shooting war or a complicated story, your editor's back, the editor who has 30, 40 years of experience is sitting back in the newsroom. And here's a cub reporter who has to try and figure out everything, how to, avoid liability issues, how to actually get the story and execute it properly, which person to talk to, which person to believe. So it's not as easy, and I would urge anyone in this situation, and it's perfect for journalists. If you're sent out to do a story, are you going to decide in the moment? I don't care what story they sent me to do. I'm going to go in a completely different direction, regardless of the standards and preferences of my editor or his boss or the publisher or the publication itself. I'm a freelancer. I'm going to change the system right here on the spot on my own, based on my own values and my own preferences. You can try that. It doesn't happen very often because the organization is going to probably punish you for that, because the organization wouldn't work if everyone, look, there's 35,000 cops. You can't have 35,000 policies. People saying, well, you want me to stop these people for jumping the turnstile? I don't think so. I'm not going to do that. That's a formula for chaos. And so we collectively as a society have to figure out how to get control of this thing and this thing called the NYPD. And the NYPD, when given orders, we have the right as citizens to expect those orders to be followed. So all I'm saying is, in the stop and frisk era, the problem to me, as I lived through it, was the problem was that they were given those orders. And the problem was those orders were blessed by the editorial boards and the donors and the civic groups and the political leadership. And as long as that's the case, you can yell at the cop all you want or ask them to be a hero and sacrifice their career. But I don't think that's the right lever to pull if you want to really make change.
Okay. So the thing is, with journalists, we don't have a gun and a badge and authority. So we can be faced with those sorts of ethical dilemmas, and we can choose to go with our heart or not. But with police, they have people's lives in their hands. Like, they have the approval of the state to do whatever they want to do, almost, within, yeah.
Yes.
So I do feel like they have a stronger responsibility to make an ethical choice in those moments. And if that means disregarding their captain's orders, or, laying off on overly targeting certain groups, then I feel like that's what they should do. Just as a moral thing, but
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, look, you'll find this, I think, as you interview some of the people involved. In fact, let's shift it off policing. Shift it over to the fire department. We asked those people. New York is unique in this, but New York has this famous interior attack where the standard way to fight a fire is that a bunch of guys, mostly guys, run into a burning building and fight the fire from inside the burning building. That is a crazy and unreasonable thing to ask anyone to do, as a worker for the city for, whatever it is, $60,000, $70,000 a year. Here's your gear, here's your training, here's your authority. When there's a fire, run inside the burning building and fight it from the inside. And if you don't come out, well, we'll pay your widow, your survivors, a nice pension, and we'll put up a nice picture of you on the wall, and we'll thank you for your service. We're asking cops to do something similar. I personally think that they have too many weapons and not enough training. I mean, and we call them for the wrong reasons. To me, the most interesting part of a reform movement that ended up with the unfortunate title Defund the Police, what they were really arguing for substantively was, don't call them so often. Let's reorganize and redeploy the police. Send them to like one interview I did. I picked up a phrase that was, I think, very apt, which is to say, police are what we could call violence workers. They are there to bring violence, right? There are certain circumstances in which that's exactly what the situation calls for. When there is a suicide-oriented or suicide bomber or killer driving a truck down a pedestrian and bike lane on the west side, killing people, you need a violence worker to stop them. When 9/11 happens, when there's a bomber in Chelsea who's putting, pressure cookers on the street to blow up whoever happens to walk by, there are times when you actually have to bring violence. And that's what we have the police for. The problem is we send them to a lot of other things where that level of response is both unwise, uncalled for, possibly even unlawful. So we call them because, hey, there's literally a terrorist driving over people and killing people on the west side of Manhattan. Call the violence workers in and let's stop this. But then, there's somebody who's off his meds that everybody in the neighborhood knows who's on the street yelling, or there's some guy who's homeless on the subway, who's just kind of acting out. And then we bring that same kind of force and that same kind of response. It's a huge mistake. We cannot disavow the responsibility. So I think simply condemning people for enacting a policy that we unwisely did not really try and think through and figure out is not fair to anybody and doesn't solve the problem. So New York has taken some very, in my opinion, small steps in the direction of not always sending cops as the first responders when there's a person who has a mental health challenge, somebody who's seriously mentally ill or off their meds or acting out. You do not want to send a person with a gun. I mean, it's just a bad idea. It has resulted in pain and tragedy and waste and confusion of purpose. And we have to straighten this out. We have to straighten this out. I mean, you cannot expect, the sergeant on duty to do it. You cannot expect, there's this whole ideology that is built up where there are cops who think of themselves as, upholding civilization, or like, they're in the Wild West defending society against society's enemies, and it becomes very black and white. And if you're one of society's enemies, anything that they do is acceptable,
Right.
and I just don't see it that way,
Well, I'll
Yeah.
jump in there and
Yeah.
I'll say the problem is, as I see it as well, society's enemies historically, Black people have been criminalized and like painted as the problem, right? There's studies from the Vera Institute of
Sure.
Justice that says that these things are true. It's not just
Yeah, yeah.
opinions.
No,
It's like
totally
studies
understood.
that Black
Understood.
people, they of course have been endured redlining. They've been in marginalized neighborhoods that is known to cause more cycles of crime. And so, you do have quote unquote crime hotspots. And you do have the reality that, Black men are killed by other Black men most of the time. So you have these truths, and then you have cops and the general public having the perception of Black people being criminal in this way. And so that's where racial profiling comes from. That's where the implicit bias of police comes from.
Mhm.
And then they're operating from that perspective of, oh, Black people tend to be the problem, the enemy in society. Like they're committing the violent crimes.
Sure.
So I feel like it leads to a culture of police operating from that perspective. And it leads to that disconnect between Black and brown communities and the police institution, because they're thinking, oh, they're already are profiling us. They treat us differently from white people. And that is a huge problem. And I don't feel like society treats it that way. I feel like we're at a place where segregation is over. There's so many interracial relationships. Like nobody wants to think about race anymore. It's such an unsavory topic. But here it is still manifesting in one of the most important institutions. Important in terms of like the weight policing has in society. Just like you're saying, it's integral because we need violence responders. But yet there's this element of racism that I feel is too often minimized. And I also believe that, the existence of Black police officers doesn't really help the situation that much. Like there's been studies that
Yeah,
say it
that's right.
doesn't help the situation that much. So what more as a society could we be doing to change things? Because last thing I'll say, you didn't like the slogan defund the police. Understood.
It was inaccurate.
The activists themselves could explain what they meant by that. But if we don't defund the police, I guess I'm assuming you want us to reform the police. That might be a bit more savory, right? But all the reformations that have been proposed over the years, they get swept under the rug. They get thrown out silently. They never get implemented. Even something like body-worn cameras, they flipped it and they refused to release the camera footage to the Civilian Complaint Review Board so that there can be oversight. And so like the police just have so much power that every time reforms are proposed, they just shoot it down, or they manipulate it so that it's just the very least change that is very minimal and doesn't affect the grand scheme of things. So what do we do then? Do we say reform the police and have that be our slogan and see if the public is more comfortable with that?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily use the reform. I would say, redirect, reorganize, reorient, find a different set of priorities. I would say, sort of take away some of their involvement, like reduce their involvement. I don't know how else to put it. Saying defunding, I just thought it was a bad idea because number one, it wasn't substantively what they were actually calling for, and number two, I knew that there would be a huge backlash, and it was actually much worse than I had even imagined. But it was just like a crazy backlash that was entirely foreseeable, like entirely, because how people think of the police, how society thinks of the police, is very different than how the critics who move that slogan forward think of the police, and the gap has led to a backlash that we are all now dealing with. Look, the reality of it is you don't want to, as if you're a reformer or even a social revolutionary, you don't want to just keep chasing a rabbit from one field to the next, right? Like you just want to put an end to it, right? What I see happening is, for example, there were too many stops. There were a lot of profiling, a lot of stops. It was found to be unconstitutional. The reason the cops put down in a lot of cases was marijuana possession. And there was a whole set of problems with that because marijuana had been decriminalized, So yes, it was on the books. And you weren't supposed to have it above a certain amount, and the cops were stopping them using all kinds of weird pretexts. Oh, I thought I smelled some weed in the car, therefore I tossed everybody in the car, searched the trunk, and a lot of really questionable stops were. To me, the solution was not to. And this was used as one of the arguments for legalizing weed in New York. And I said, and I think I'm already proven right, but I think I'll definitely be proven right over time, that is like, if you take that away from them, they'll just find some other pretext because what they want to do is stop people, right? So let's get to the heart of the problem, that you want them to stop doing this. Changing their budget is not going to make that change. They'll just move it from the regular budget to the overtime budget. Taking away, or legalizing weed is not going to do it because they'll just find something else. They'll say, well, we thought they were gambling. Oh, we thought they had a weapon. Oh, we thought that, he looked like he matched the description of a domestic violence suspect or something like that. I think you have to get to the heart of the problem. Why are the police being used to harm certain outgroups in society? Why does society want that? Why are they sending the cops to do that? And what can we do about it? I thought one of the more hopeful and interesting phenomenon of the last few years was the major upsurge. The largest public demonstrations in U.S. history were around policing during the pandemic in 2020. An amazing amount, I wrote a couple of articles about this, an amazing amount of legislation that had been bottled up and sitting around for years just moved through. It accounts for how we got bail reform in New York. And these are meaningful changes. It's partly how and why, even prior to that, Bill de Blasio got elected. I mean, it was one of his major campaign planks to reduce the number of stops dramatically, which did happen. It's the critics will say that it's still discriminatory. There's still a disproportionate number of black and brown people being stopped, but the sheer number of stops is like 90% less, 80% less. That's not nothing. That's meaningful. So I think you move as intelligently as you can in whatever direction offers the hope of progress, because it shifts from year to year, season to season. All it takes is one horrible case for the public to change their minds about any given reform or about policing itself. And so, if we're going to be in this for the long haul, and after 40 years, I would have to put myself in that category. If we're going to keep talking about this, you gotta go to the heart of it. You got to go to the heart of it. And one thing I thought that was great about the Black Lives Matter marches was that people who were not directly affected by the phenomenon of discriminatory policing marched in the streets and said, "We want an end to this." That is huge and unprecedented in my lifetime. So years and years of studies, marches, seminars, podcasts, radio broadcasts, articles, and so forth, brought us to a point where a very large number of people said, no, we just don't want this. And in jurisdictions that you would never think would move this stuff, North Carolina, like all kinds of places, Florida, they started dialing back some of the policies that were known to have caused harm.
Well, I think that was because the video footage of George Floyd's murder was so egregious. Like, it moved a lot of people. I couldn't even watch it because I was like, oh, I'm already passionate about this. I don't need to become even more passionate. Let's put it that way. However, I don't feel like these changes should happen on the backs of the people that are brutalized by it. They're losing their lives. Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Botham Jean, Ahmaud Arbery, all of them.
Kowalski,
There's so
Trawick,
many names. Trayvon Martin.
Michael Griffith.
They
They
shouldn't be like markers of social change. They were victims of police violence, and we shouldn't wait for there to be terrible cases like that in order to move the reforms forward. And it's not just about the people that die. There's people that have been brutalized by police. There's also the psychological element of feeling like I'm in a body that police don't respect. I'm in a body that police are going to speak to me any kind of way, and I have to just swallow my pride as a man and do whatever they say, or else I could be in big trouble. There's people whose livelihoods have been affected by unfairly going to jail or prison. So we need to understand that the scope of harm being done is significant enough that we should be able to keep pressure on the officials and the police constantly so that the changes can happen without there needing to be these big moments of someone suffering so monumentally in order for it to happen, if you get what I'm saying. And so just to continue on that, what troubles me is that there's this whole Blue Lives Matter movement. I cannot stand it. And I don't care if that makes me seem biased. I don't care. I would love for someone to come on and prove to me why I should love Blue Lives Matter. But as I see it, you guys have a symbol, not you, but the folks in Blue Lives Matter have a symbol of what seems to be an American flag in black and white, and then a blue stripe between it, representing the fact that the NYPD wears blue and they're protecting society. Like, it's a very strange symbol. And furthermore, they created that movement and that slogan based on the Black Lives Matter movement and uprising, almost in direct opposition to it.
Absolutely indirect.
And that's a very odd and dangerous place to be, because then you're saying, oh, actually, people should be pro-police. You guys should support us, even when we're brutalizing Black and brown people. Like, what? I don't get what exactly they're trying to say by juxtaposing these two movements. And I see a lot of police officers. I know a couple of them personally. I've seen them with the little logo wearing. I've never said anything because I'm like, okay.
It's a violation. You could probably report them. You are not supposed to display anything other than, there's a certain amount of approved regalia, that is not part of it. So when people are doing that, they're actually in violation of explicit NYPD policy. Here's something you should be aware of. Movements, social movements, and this is true, generally, social movements give rise to counter movements. Those counter movements are not only to be expected, but what you should also expect is that they will be just as passionate. They will be tactically similar. They will, like most social movements, stay around until they either succeed or they go out of business, right? And so I remember after they were calling it the Blue Wave at the time. There's some people would say Blue Lives Matter, and then they would have demonstrations, the Blue Wave. There were Black Lives Matter movement march, and then there'd be like a Blue Wave movement. And I called up some Black Lives Matter leaders, and I said, is this a real movement, or is this them just kind of doing a little bit of pushback? And they said, no, it's a real movement. It's a real movement. And I started to, I checked it out a little bit, not in depth. I didn't report personally, but I certainly looked at a lot of their materials. And it did confirm what I just said to you, which is that it's a real movement. It's a real movement. There are people who feel just as passionately as Black Lives Matter marchers that this is the thin blue line that separates us from anarchy. These people are heroes. They should be celebrated. They should always be believed. They need to be armed. There need to be more of them. I'm a little dumbfounded at that on one level, but it is what it is, right? I mean, you get used to it, right? Again, just think of it as a math equation. Movement gives rise to counter movement, and that's how it is. And they will fight it out. They'll fight it out, and we'll call it democracy.
But isn't that what we said about racism for decades? It is what it is. This is how things are. Segregation.
I mean, look, there was a backlash to the civil rights movement that I lived through, right? I mean, so you need to be aware of it. I mean, look, there are a lot of questions were raised about how do we get the first black president followed by Donald Trump? It's the phenomenon I just described to you. Movement gives rise to, breakthrough, step back. Movement, counter movement. Civil rights movement, white backlash. That's just how it is. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. And it's not even uniquely American, by the way. I mean, much of what I'm telling you is a sort of a spin-off of what Marx was talking about with the dialectic. I don't want to get too philosophical here, but
yeah, it's pretty philosophical.
No, what I mean, but he says, capitalism followed by socialism, equal movements, and then it resolves in his theory as communism. Didn't quite work out that way, but the basic dynamics I think are exactly right, and it's what you would expect. I mean, there are plenty of people who get off the couch because they see something going on that they don't like, right? So the anti-abortion movement scored a major victory by getting the Supreme Court, by stacking the Supreme Court and then getting those justices to overturn Roe versus Wade. There is right now a counter movement in motion that you can perceive. There are many, many, many women who were previously not all that politically active who are coming out in busloads. And we've seen, some hints of it, but it's pretty much what you would expect.
Okay, Errol. So I hear everything you're saying, and it's definitely a conversation that we as society need to continue having. But what really bothers me is to feel like, as a Black woman, I have to go through life pretending like I don't see the difference in how my white friends interact with police and how my Black friends do, and to see like my white neighbor being all cheery. He's in his car, he's in the middle of the road, the police officer had stopped someone else, and he's like talking to the police officer, having this cheerful conversation. He's blocking traffic. Police officer doesn't even tell him anything, and it's ha ha ha, yeah, all right, you have a good day, woo. And then for a lot of Black people, it's a completely different dynamic. That's not right. Like, that's an institution that clearly is protecting white people and has this rapport with white people that it doesn't have with Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's freakish,
Yes. Well, I would commend you and celebrate your inability to make your peace with injustice, right? So if that's what's going on, don't ever get used to it and don't ever stop fighting. That's number one. But also, look, one thing that fascinates me is that the whole leadership of the NYPD is Black at this point, right? I mean, Black and Latino, the commissioner, the first deputy, or I should say the chief of department, the mayor, who himself is an ex-cop for the first time in New York history. We have a different set of, there's different chess pieces on the board now, right? So if you're going to play this game for a while, it's worth understanding, because I think some new rules are being introduced here, or at least the pieces are not black and white the way they used to be on the chessboard. And I frankly don't know what that means at this point. There's a lot of history that's out there, and we could probably look at what happened when black mayors, including ex-police officers, were elected in, Los Angeles or Detroit or Gary, Indiana or Washington, D.C. or anywhere else. But this is new for New York. And it holds some really interesting questions. There'll be no easy answers. I've seen enough of police culture to know that it is very powerful, and it is very hard to change that culture. I heard the NYPD once described as a nation state, and I think they are. They have their own foreign policy. They have people stationed all overseas in like a dozen different countries. They've got, helicopters and boats, and, they got their own songs and their own uniform. When my father passed, he got an NYPD funeral, and they draped a flag over the coffin, and they all snapped to attention, and they had a whole color guard there, and they folded up the flag and gave it to us. It's not the American flag. It's the flag of the NYPD. They are a nation state.
Interesting. I remember you said that term in class.
Yeah.
And I took note of it.
Yeah, they are their own country, man. They proudly fly their own flag.
Yeah.
Yes, it is worth the study. It is worth the time. Don't get discouraged. There are some reforms like 50A, reforming it so that the public can see the disciplinary records of cops. I saw something the other day. I mean, you probably saw this too. I'd never seen anything like it. There are protesters going back and forth with the police during a demonstration. I think it was over Palestine or something, over Gaza. And the woman takes his name, looks up his phone, looks up his record, starts calling off his name and the different cases that he had been involved in alleging misconduct in real time. In the middle of a demonstration, the guy backed right down once he realized his name was being called and the names of the cases he had been involved in and the allegations of misconduct. I was like, that's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
That's powerful stuff. So,
Yeah.
Baby steps for now.
All right. Well, I think that's our time. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right.
Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
this.
Thank you guys for tuning in.
Okay. I got to run.